So welcome, everyone. My name is Dale Robertson. I'm with the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and appreciate everyone coming here today, the Van Andel Museum Center and the Meijer Theater, for this special presentation, Making the MexiRican City with Dr. Fernandez. I'd like to just take 1 second here to quickly recognize two of our board members here today, our governing body, the trustees of the Grand Rapids Public Museum, and Marlon Fayan is here, as is Lupe Ramos Montini. So thank you both for being here today. So really, this is part of a series of things that we've actually begun doing. It kind of takes us back to a place that we had been previously, but are really embracing again. And it really all stems from really the core of the museum and what it is. So yeah, we have 250,000 artifacts and specimens by the most conservative count, collected over 169 years. 98% of those artifacts and specimens donated by the people of West Michigan. So when we talk about us being a public entity and a community-based entity, I'm not lying. We are. We are owned to this day by the city of Grand Rapids. So we are truly a public museum, truly owned by all of you here. But the core, really the thing, right, the lesson, the takeaway, what sticks with you from those artifacts and specimens are the stories, right? The stories that those tell, the stories that you make, stories how your story becomes my story. And so much of it goes back to place. And you see right in the title of this book, Placemaking is right there in the actual title. So this is an opportunity to talk about this place, the narrative that we all create, because it's the narrative by which we all make decisions, if you really just stop and think about it. So this is going to be good. I'm really looking forward to it, and we're going to have a lot of high energy here and some great stories, which then make the narrative. So my story becomes your story becomes my story, and that is how we continue to make community, making the MexiRican City. So with that, please welcome my colleague, Vice President of Human Resources and Legal Counsel, Mary Beth Jelks.
Thank you for you guys coming out. I mean, who would have thought October 1st we'd have 80-degree weather, huh? And between that and the football games and everything, I just really appreciate you being here. And I thank our boss, the CEO, Dale, for really supporting and wanting to do this presentation, because we know how important it is to our city. The introduction is like crazy. She has so many accolades, so I'm gonna nail it down to just a minute and a half. Forgive me, Delia. Dr. Fernandez is an associate history professor at Michigan State University. She was born and raised here in Grand Rapids in the comfort of her tight-knit family, whose history and their roots go back over 70 years. Dr. Fernandez is a first-generation college student who earned a BA degree from Grand Valley State University, I should say, and she got her master's and her PhD. Being a U of M alum, it hurts me to say it, but Ohio State University. So I guess a few good things come out of Ohio State. In addition to publishing 2 award-winning articles on Latinos, the history of Latinos in Michigan, Dr. Fernandez's new groundbreaking work in this book that we're going to have discussion on today and presentation, Making the MexiRican, I love that, MexiRican City, Mexican and Puerto Rican Migration, Activism, and Placemaking in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is what the topic is today. That was published by the University of Illinois in 2023. Her research incorporates extensive primary sources centering on Latino placemaking struggles, triumphs, and narratives in an effort to shape this Midwestern city. The history of Grand Rapids, and this is important, being married to a historian myself, I can say this. The history of Grand Rapids as we know it prior to Delia publishing this book will never be the same about Grand Rapids. It can never be told, the story of Grand Rapids can never now be told without this component of the narrative. That is, to me, the Latina footprint, right, on our history. The museum is very proud to host this presentation and panel discussion because we believe that, like every other community in Grand Rapids, the Latino community will continue to have significant impact on our city and on our future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Delia Fernandez to the podium.
All right. Does that sound good? Okay. Yep. There it is. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for being here. I just want to say appreciation to my folks and everybody who has, the panelists who have supported me, who mentored me, especially La Familia Jelks, Mary Beth, Randall Jelks. If it were not for Randall Jelks' work on African Americans in the Furniture City, I couldn't have conceived that there could be a book on Latinos in Grand Rapids as well. And so I'm here today on, from the support and the mentorship and guidance from a community of people. And I just want to acknowledge that while we're here today. So
the first question people always ask is, how did you come up with a book like this? Right, and it comes from deeply personal experiences of not quite understanding my own belonging. So I would leave the Midwest as a MexiRican woman and meet Latinos from New York or from the West Coast who would say, how did that happen? How are you MexiRican? How are you Mexican and Puerto Rican? I thought they didn't like each other. They just didn't get along. And then I would be here in Michigan, where I know I have these deep roots, and people would say, okay, well, where are you really from? And Grand Rapids, well, really, where are you from? Right? Alluding to something that means that I didn't quite actually belong here. People couldn't conceive of me belonging here in the same way they could conceive of themselves. And so on a personal search, something we say in graduate school all the time is research is often research, and that is okay. Right? You can research your community because oftentimes you have information that no one else gets access to. And so that's where I am coming from with this book. So what you'll hear about today is the way that I argue that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans were set on an interrelated and interdependent journey that starts back 100 years, right before so many things even happened, before people started to leave, that brought them to Grand Rapids in the ways that they tried to fit in to a imagined black-white racial binary that the city ascribed to. And the main argument of my book is that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans created pan-ethnic or pan-Latino relationships much earlier than other historians have argued, who look at it as the 1970s as something that was born out of social movements. And I argue that it's really for social connection, for a desire to be able to talk with somebody at work, or to dance at a bar after work, or to have somebody's house to visit after church. And so those connections then served as a base for activism that brought them to fights against the city of Grand Rapids in the realm of city hiring, police brutality, and education to make Grand Rapids a place that they can meet their social, political, and educational needs. So I point to very clearly colonialism, imperialism, racial violence, and economic displacement as factors that made it so that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans could no longer stay in their homes or their places of origin and set them on paths of migration. And so I start in the book covering the War of 1848. And this is in the period of manifest destiny. So this is this idea that Anglo settlers at the time, is what they would have been called, had that they had a divine right, that God must have ordained this for them to take over lands that indigenous people and other peoples had already lived on in the United States as they moved westward. And this, I point to 1848 as one of these ruptures that creates the instability in people's homelands that make them leave. So after the war, you'll recall, right, big parts of Mexico become the United States. In addition to all of the resources that people, that the United States receives with that land, including copper and gold, livestock, they also get 100,000 people. 100,000 people that are living in what was once Mexico and now is the United States. And it's that transition between what was Mexican society and Mexican ways of landowning and property holding that many, that transition to the U.S. system, that many Mexican landowners lose access to their lands. And we're going from a system that was in Spanish to a system that's in English, different levels of bureaucracy. And when families can't produce deeds that the U.S. system recognizes, they are displaced, right? White Anglo settlers took over their land, which often set people on a path of wage labor and migratory labor to be able to make ends meet. And then about 50 years later, we see a very similar situation in the War of 1898, where this is between the U.S. and Spain officially, but it has massive ramifications for Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and Cuba. And so this is another part of Manifest Destiny. This is the extension of Manifest Destiny into imperialism. This war made it so that Puerto Rico essentially went from Spanish power to control by the U.S., making it essentially a colony in which it still functions to this day as a colony of the United States. And in 1898, after that war, the island was then governed by military leaders and business owners. And one of those business owners owned a sugar company in Puerto Rico, grew sugar. So Puerto Rico then, their economy turns to more of a one crop system with all of the energy going into sugar, which has disastrous effects if something happens to that one crop, or if you get competitions for that one crop. And in 1917, among other policies towards Puerto Rico, the U.S. also made it so that Puerto Rico's only trading partner could be the United States. It also acquires other places that have that grow sugar, which really devastate this economy. And then lastly, I point to 1910, the Mexican Revolution, that also was one of these instances of rupture where people needed to leave home. So the revolution, the root of it, in short, is that Mexican elites allowed for U.S. and Great Britain to take over lands in Mexico. They sold lands, the lands that were highly valuable. They had oil, they had arable land. The ways that people were making a living before on the land were no longer accessible to them. They were accessible to businesses. And this made it so that a very few people had money and control over their lives and access to land. And so what they would have called peasant farmers, or people who were just farming to sustain themselves or to trade with others, were no longer able to sustain their lives, right, in those places. So that's what caused the revolution, and then the violence from the revolution, including compulsory military draft, made it so that people were leaving in droves over the border at almost 400,000 people in that time period, between 1910 and 1920. And I see that kind of extension of U.S. imperialism in Mexico during the Revolution era as part of economic displacement. But another thing that I take very seriously in trying to uncover the reasons why people would leave is racial violence. Right? So in addition to understanding that people were leaving Mexico to go to Texas, people from Texas, Mexicans who settle in Texas, also leave Texas. Right? Part of this is the migratory labor stream because of the without access to land, but the other part is racial violence. And so I think we're more familiar with the narrative of lynching, the lynching of African Americans in the Jim Crow South. And it's something that we're taught in our history courses if we're lucky, right? But this also occurred with Mexican Americans in the Southwest. So research by two historians in the book Forgotten Dead explores the rate and what happened behind extralegal violence, or lynchings, as we call them, mob violence, towards Mexicans and Mexican Americans in this time period. And what they know is that the number of people, Mexicans who were lynched in this time period, is about proportionate to the population. Or the rate at which people were lynched was proportionate to the population, as was with African Americans in the South. But one of the things that you can see from these rise in numbers is that they correspond with border interactions. So 51 to 60 is that post Mexican American War period. The 87 to 80 is when we experimented with free trade. With that, when people came back and forth. In 1911 to 1920 is the Revolution years. And so anytime that there were interaction at the border, this was something that was happening. One of the other things that these two historians found is that this often corresponded to land border. While Texas and California have the largest populations, it's Texas who has the largest land border. And so that racial violence that existed in Texas, right, is one of the reasons that many people felt unsafe there and took to migration. The other part that I should tell you is that considering that this happened to Mexican Americans in the Southwest and African Americans in the South, this actually tells us, this is more proof that this lynching is not necessarily about a lack of a judicial system or a lack of structure in these areas, but more about how white folks use lynching as a tool to supplant themselves atop racial hierarchies. Right? So there was hierarchies already in the Southwest. Right? Mexicans have their own hierarchies. But as Anglo settlers came in and put themselves atop those after those transition, these lynchings were a way of saying, we hold the power in this society. And the other way that we know that is that a lot of the reasons outside of issues like theft or robbery that people were accused of, as the crime they were accused of, but no one was ever really tried, is that other reasons for lynching Mexican Americans included being of Mexican descent, or courting a white woman, or taking a white man to court, or refusing to plead the fifth. These things that indicate that there was a societal shift happening and a racial hierarchy that was moving, and folks were willing to enforce it with this type of violence. So I take seriously all of those factors as why people would not stay in their places of origins and why they would be willing to move, right, as a way of survival, as a way of ensuring their futures. I also look at how Mexicans and Puerto Ricans come to West Michigan. And I point to railroad work as one of the main reasons that people are coming, the main type of employment that's available to them. By the late 1800s into the early 1900s, rail work is very synonymous with Mexican laborers and African American laborers. While there had been European Americans building these tracks, and of course Chinese building these tracks, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and many European Americans were gaining access to whiteness, and with that came better and better jobs, leaving Mexican Americans and African Americans to work, to maintenance, and to ride the rails. And so most of the time what I found is that many Mexicans who came to Michigan started in, wherever they started in Mexico, if they got to Zacatecas, the central region in Mexico that has a train stop right there. If you could get there, you then get to Nuevo Laredo, then to Laredo across the border, to San Antonio, and then from San Antonio, you get to Kansas City, and from there to Chicago, where you can essentially go anywhere, right, by this time. And then from Chicago into Grand Rapids. And I also point to, from once you get into Grand Rapids, you really to Chicago, you could go to Grand Rapids, Lansing, Jackson, Detroit, Saginaw, kind of all across lower Michigan in that line, more or less.
And I also point to agriculture, right? I look deeply into agriculture because this is one of the main ways that Mexicans and later Puerto Ricans are recruited to come to Michigan. So this I found in this is a document from the 1940s from sugar beet growers, a growers association. They were having a meeting talking about labor shortages. And so this is how they thought about Mexicans and their use in labor. The Mexican is considered an ideal sugar beet worker by the sugar beet grower. While considerable effort has been made to encourage the available local worker to do this work, it is doubtful if sufficient qualified labor could be found locally to take care of all the thinning, hoeing, weeding, and topping of the sugar beet. It appears that when the local workers do take these jobs, some of them leave before completing their contract, which may account for the fact that the Mexican field worker is desirable from the grower's point of view. And since the local worker prefers to work in the industrial plants and is able to earn more in that type of work, it is doubtful if a sufficient supply of local or semi-local workers willing to accept the field work jobs could be found. So there's a lot to read into that. Right. So the local worker or the semi-local worker is read as white, right? They're talking about white workers who are living in the Thumb region and saying that they are, not actually very good field workers and that they prefer industrial jobs, which makes an assumption that Mexicans don't prefer industrial jobs. They would have loved industrial jobs, but for the most part, they were barred from industrial jobs in this particular time period. They're barred from unions as well. And so many of them, to say that Mexicans were, more likely to do this work because they needed it or they liked it, right, doesn't take into account the societal factors of discrimination that limited their opportunities. And I share this photo of my grandmother's family. So it's my great-grandmother, my grandmother in the corner, and my aunts and my uncle, great-uncle, who were farm laborers in Saginaw. My grandmother was born in Saginaw, as well as many of her siblings, because they were part of that migration that left from Mexico to Texas, from Texas to Michigan. So this is a part of a book called Tejano Diaspora that talks about the movement of Tejanos across the rest of the country for migratory labor. And it's just to show you the places and the kind of reach and the depth that Americans from Texas were going in the first part of a growing season, right? There's parts of the season where they're needed to do particular jobs, planting, right, as opposed to picking and harvesting. And then you can see during the second part, like the movement is going in a lot of different directions, but so much of it is coming to Michigan. At the same time, we also have bracero workers who are coming on 6-month contracts. They're coming directly from Mexico by 1942, well into the 1960s. So we also have Mexican nationals who are sharing fields with Mexican Americans. And by post-World War II, they're sharing fields with Puerto Ricans as well. So I talked about Puerto Rico being a monocrop society by this point, and we got into once we got to the Great Depression, while it was bad here, it was bad in Puerto Rico. It was really bad in Puerto Rico. There were starvation wages, and people were starving due to different environmental factors, but also a failure in policy. By this time, by World War II, island administrators and mainland administrators are saying things like, perhaps Puerto Rico is overpopulated. And that's the problem. And if we move people off the island, there'll be more resources. When in fact, that's flawed, right? That there were enough resources, they were just not distributed, right? They were not distributed in a way that allowed for people to stay on the island, to live full lives there. And so we started sending Puerto Ricans off of the island to help with World War II positions, like in factories and railroads. But by 1950, we also started engaging in agricultural migration, planned agricultural migration. But I want to point out on the two ends here, we have the cover and a page from a booklet that was given to Puerto Rican migrants by the Migration Division, a division of the Puerto Rican government on the mainland. So when migrants arrived to the mainland, they could get one of these booklets that told people about, like, this is what you can expect for winter, or this is what people in the United States eat, for example. But they also say things like, Nueva York no es la única ciudad, that New York isn't the only city, because Puerto Ricans going to New York start to get, they're starting to be stereotyped, right, as poor and here for welfare, not taking into account the colonial conditions that put them on that path, right? And then it says here, right, look, there are groups of Puerto Ricans in cities in California, in Michigan, in Ohio, in Illinois. Go there, basically, is what it's telling them, to spread out, right? And indeed, that's what happened, right? That is what happened when we took up planned agricultural migration, what was often called airlifts. Michigan, as well as other places, started to recruit workers directly from Puerto Rico. And in 1950, during an acute labor shortage, there were over 5,000 Puerto Ricans who came to Saginaw and across Michigan to be able to help with the labor shortage. And when I mean they were flew in, and not necessarily in a passenger plane, but in an old commando, right? A plane that was used for the military. People were sitting on the floor, shoved into the plane. And there was even an accident in which almost more than half people died. But to tell you how destitute the situation was, for the survivors, only 3 requested to go home, and the others requested to continue to Michigan for these jobs on a bus, right? To just give you an idea of what they were dealing with. And of course, if you read Spanish, you know that these weren't great conditions, right? That this says they describe horrors in the fields of Michigan. Basically saying that once they got there, they found that after working for weeks that they would owe their employer. They were owed for transportation, they were owed for food, they were owed for housing, which were all substandard, right? All substandard housing at the time. And so that this part at the bottom says, this is slavery in the 20th century, underneath the American flag, this symbol of liberty. As Puerto Ricans, they're citizens, and they use that to their advantage. They did leave, they voted with their feet, is what we call it. Many did go to New York, but they also went to Ohio, they went to Lorain, they went to Cleveland and Upper Ohio, they went to Indiana, Northwest Indiana, to Illinois, but they also went to Detroit and to Grand Rapids and other places around the state to try to find better conditions. And so if you can see the places where there's stars, those are places where Puerto Rican workers were and were writing letters to the governor, asking for his intercession, basically saying, like, my wife is expecting a paycheck and they say I owe money and I'm not sure what's gonna happen to them if I don't send any money. Can you please check on them? One person wrote the governor asking for the Red Cross to come and get him, right? Likening this to like wartime, right? Wartime situations. Some folks found fields that were not as bad as the others. There's a group of Puerto Ricans who find Lake Odessa as a place where even the Puerto Rican Migration Division that had been investigating all this said, we have not received one complaint from Lake Odessa in this period, which was a very big deal considering the letters that were piling in the 1950s. And so some Puerto Ricans started to make their way west to Lake Odessa and then eventually to Grand Rapids, as did Mexican Americans and Mexicans who were maybe started off in the Thumb region and moved that way. So what did they come into when they came to Grand Rapids? And this part of the book, I talk about the racial binary, that in Grand Rapids, you basically, at this time, if you were white or you were black, and indigenous people were kind of a non-factor in the local hierarchy. And so where did Mexicans and Puerto Ricans as multiracial people, right? They have African, European, indigenous ancestry that marks families very differently, right? Even members of the family look different from one another because of these mixtures. Where did they fit into this binary? And so I started to use a unique record group, jail records, to read across the grain to be able to figure out how people were thinking about them. And this is mostly because there's not a lot of records on Mexicans and Puerto Ricans at this time period. All of the agencies that we might think had looked into poor people, marginalized people, were not paying attention to this group. And so this became an archive that I could read, right? Not for the purpose of understanding necessarily what it was made for. It was made to tell us about an arrest, right? But reading it across the grain, and many of them, gives me a demographic profile of Latinos, Mexicans, and Puerto Ricans that did not exist anywhere else. And one of the things that I could see, right, is the racial composition issue. So this is a Mexican worker, Rosario. He was born in Mexico. That's his nationality. He stayed, his residence, it was in Kansas City. So that ties back to that railroad, right? That railroad trajectory. His offense was larceny of coal. It was a wintertime arrest, which tells me he likely had access to coal, right? As a railroad worker, and that he was cold. Wherever he was living, right? It was probably cold. But the part that really interests me is that on these cards in the 1940s, we took down race of somebody as color, and we also took down complexion. So your color was what we think of as race, and your complexion is literally what you look like. And so while Rosario was marked as white on the reverse side of this, his complexion was simply put as Mexican. So this tells us that whoever was taking the record did not necessarily have a word to describe what they were seeing or to understand where this person fit within the racial hierarchy. Because a complexion, where for white folks it might have said light, or for black folks it said brown or dark brown. But for Mexicans, it started saying things like Mexican or cinnamon or chestnut, or all of these things that we might use to describe food or animals, but we had to use to describe people because they didn't understand where these multiracial people fit into the hierarchy. And this was not something that was just in records, but also in the lived experience of people. So this is Irma Garcia Aguilar, a longstanding community member who recorded this interview. This is her elementary school picture about her time as a young person coming to Grand Rapids in the 1950s and 60s. So life was a struggle. Life was hard. I was not white. I was not black. I was other. So it was difficult. There are a lot of parents that would not allow anybody to play with somebody as dark as you. Right? So she was feeling this, right? She felt this on a very personal level. And this was particular to her experience as a racially mixed Mexican-American woman who probably presented as indigenous or mixed indigenous. But for Afro-Latinos or Afro-Puerto Ricans who had African ancestry, their experience was very much like that of Black Americans in Grand Rapids. Meaning they had the same limited opportunities for housing and segregated housing that was happening, including jobs. And so Afro-Latinos reported a sense of isolation because when they were segregated, living next to African-Americans, they also did not share a language. So they could not commiserate, right, in a shared language. So while the community also had to deal with colorism, right, amongst itself, they're also dealing with the segregated landscape of Grand Rapids. So I point to the ways that, given all of these obstacles that they had in Grand Rapids in making a home, a lot of these things push them together more or less, right? We still have the issues they have to contend with, but they push them together. And on top of that, these shared experiences with Catholicism, language, other cultural aspects allowed for them to see one another as social equals much earlier than other places. And so I point to the Catholic Church and the Mexican Apostolate that was formed in the 1940s by Mexican and Mexican-American immigrants and migrants who asked the diocese, right, for this formal recognition to have a Mexican ministry, essentially, right, to reach out, to have a place for them within the diocese. And through their own fundraising, they were able to acquire a house, a couple of houses, in fact, but a house to have a chapel, right? The first chapel that would serve Mexicans and then later Puerto Ricans as they came as well. I also talk about, by this time, by the 1950s, by the late 1950s into the mid-1960s, the population that went from about 500 right before World War II, by the 1960s, it is about 5,000. Right, that the community is growing, that Puerto Ricans are also settling, and that they're coming together to make these shared kind of cultural institutions together. So one of which I talk about is the Mexican Patriotic Committee. So this was a committee that, doubled, right? It had played a very important role within the Mexican Apostolate as a mutual aid society that was based inside of the Catholic Church and Catholicism that would help with, anything that you have going on. If you're out of work, they would help with, covering things. If somebody died, they helped to arrange so that people could get back home, to bury folks back home. It was very much similar to a union, but also a social service agency that they had formed on their own. But the other thing that they did was that they were responsible for throwing festivals and parties and these other things that allowed Mexicans and Puerto Ricans to live really full lives, right? That they weren't just, they weren't just laborers, they weren't just segregated into particular parts, that they were finding ways to make this place home. And so when I talked in the beginning about research as me search, that I have information that other people might not have. As I looked at this photo at my parents' house, my parents are here, I'm looking at it as, okay, this is the Mexican Patriotic Committee, big on their computer. And my mom walks by and is like, oh, look, it's Uncle Julio. And just like keeps walking into the kitchen and just, I'm like, excuse me? Because Uncle Julio is Puerto Rican. And this is a picture of the Mexican Patriotic Committee, right? Julio Vega. And so it was in those small instances that I started to see what was very much a personal history about my Mexican and Puerto Rican roots was actually much wider, right, in the city. And so it made sense that Julio Vega is one of the first Puerto Rican men who likely worked alongside many of these men, right, was also on the Mexican Patriotic Committee because Puerto Ricans were also going to church with Mexicans. It made sense that that could happen. And then in addition, I'd like to point out that if you look very closely behind the shoulders of these men, there are women. Right? There are women's forehead and eyebrows and hair, right? And this was so emblematic of the cultural or the gender dynamics of the community, right? That men would take the leadership position and take the credit, right, for being those in charge who were literally overshadowing the women who actually were responsible for many of the things that made these celebrations a good time to be at, right? So who cooked the food? Who taught the children the dances, the folkloric dances, who sewed the costumes, right? And so oftentimes women, even in the thinking back about their times because of gender dynamics, would not recognize that they valued, right, that they offered value. And so we have oral history participants who talk about Guadalupe Vargas, who's one of community leader, saying, no, it was my husband Daniel who did it. It was Daniel, right? And it's not until somebody else intervenes, a younger relative, who says, you did so much, right? You did the cooking, you did the cleaning. And any time that Daniel Vargas showed up with new migrants, as he often did, right, to the house, who say, oh, they're brand new here, they just got here. It was up to her to find, right, to cook a meal for everybody, but then go through the kids' clothes to see who had outgrown what to offer those to the next family, right? So they could survive. They could survive that winter, right? So there's women performing this labor that make it so that home can happen. And I also found this in the archive in terms of celebrations and festivals. In the early 1970s, there were festivals that celebrated Mexican Independence Day, all of these other religious holidays as well. And this was something I've never seen before. This is a float during the 1971 parade that kind of felt like my whole identity rolled up into one. Because there, as a MexiRican woman, right, I see the streamers of the Mexican flag, right, for this Independence Day parade. But I also see the Puerto Rican flag and the American flag in front of St. Andrew's School, right down there on Sheldon, which they would have took that route right there down to downtown. But the other part is that it's the Fernandez Bar and Float, or bar and restaurant. You can't really see it in there, but that was the restaurant and bar that my grandparents owned, which was the stories that we heard were not necessarily of this type of participation, right, about the bar, but instead what we know as working class folks who had to attend to the bar, I didn't necessarily hear about their activism, but I know from these photos that, right, they were considering themselves a part of their community. They were participating, right? They saw themselves as having a place in these festivals in downtown. And the other way that I look at how MexiRicans, this kind of MexiRican identity forges here in Grand Rapids as it becomes very commonplace, is the forging of Mexican and Puerto Rican unions. Right? So I'll go through a couple of them, but this is Juan Baez and Amelia Silva. Juan Baez is Afro-Puerto Rican. Amelia is Mexican American. This is them with their family, Amelia's siblings and all of the grandchildren. And it was hard for Juan Baez, who as an Afro-Puerto Rican man was not Amelia's dad's first choice for a partner. Right, in Grand Rapids, right, with the anti-Black sentiment, an Afro-Puerto Rican man would not necessarily mean social mobility for his daughter. Right, despite that, Carolina, the daughter of Juan and Amelia, she said, Juan Baez, she always felt like her dad was proving something, and that he He took the best care of her mother for almost 50 years until she passed. And that from the grandparents' perspective, or her perspective, or her grandparents, was that she never felt any ill will. She felt very accepted and loved in that family, but was definitely cognizant of the anti-Black sentiment that existed. This is my titi Angelita and my tío Marcial. And so this is Angelita Arazola and Marcial Hernandez. Angelita Arazola is from Gillespie, Texas, and worked with her family on the fields, and is a migrant working family, many children in their family. Marcial Hernandez came with my grandfather and other Puerto Ricans to Lake Odessa. And that's where they had met. They worked and met alongside the field, right? Again, reinforcing this idea that these folks are social equals, that they're allowed to work and live in the same places. All right, so these are the children. I'll just point out, just flash these up here, other parts, other MexiRican couples and their children, because I want to get to the part about activism. Something I spent so much time on the earlier parts, but I really want to get to the part about activism. So by the time we get to the 1970s, the Puerto Rican and Mexican population, along with Cubans who are also coming in at this time, there are about 11,000 Latinos that we have just ballooned in size, and there were not any Spanish-speaking people who worked for the city. Right? So this meant that people who were residents, were paying taxes, were doing all these things, actually did not have access to entitled benefits that they had as residents of the city. That's kind of like in the bigger picture. On the immediate, it also meant that they weren't getting access to unemployment or to welfare or things that they needed to help survive in Grand Rapids at that time. And they knew this, activists knew this, and they put pressure right on the city government. And given the conservative nature of West Michigan, this was very difficult to do, that even when the press wrote about this, they still cannot quite fess up to what's going on, right? Because if you read that headline and you're like, is that a double negative? Like, does that make quite sense? That the city job policy found not fully unbiased, right? Just a little bit, right? Like, it's biased, right? That we actually do have a bias in hiring, and that this was no secret to anybody, right? Who was on the receiving end of not getting a job within the city, right? They knew that already. And so Latinos using Model City funds, War on Poverty funding, were able to craft the Latin American Council, a one-stop shop for social services, cultural awareness, and a base for activism. So given that there were limited access to the social services provided by the city, they created their own unemployment situation. So this started as one person calling around to see who would hire and see if they would hire Latinos. They did well baby checkups there. They did elderly services, Alcoholic Anonymous. They did English classes. Sometimes, the director would open up his desk and that became an examining table, right? That this was on Granville, on Pleasant later, as a place where Latinos could get the services they needed. They also were the base for cultural awareness. This one talks about how they were able to make a library, right? Because there was at our libraries, we didn't have any content on Latinos. In the school districts, we didn't have any positive content on Latinos at the time, very limited amount of Latino teachers as well. And so they started to create cultural awareness programs from babies to the elderly. But what I really wanted to mention was that this fight for police jobs, and what it really is a fight against police brutality. Was what was happening in the 1960s from when Mexican Americans first got there, right, into the 70s, that they would have encounters with the police that ended in an incident of brutality or violence, and the police would say it's a language issue. But these were also happening to Black folks who spoke English, right? So we knew it wasn't necessarily a language issue. That instead, perhaps the policy that was there, right, was a problem. But again, given West Michigan and the conservative nature of the city, while other places in LA or Chicago might have been asking for an abolition of the police or a restructuring of the police from the bottom up, in Grand Rapids, activists knew that the best they could probably do was get more Black and Latino police officers hired under the flawed assumption that more people from their neighborhood, people policing them if they were from their neighborhood, they would be less likely to face violence. When in fact this might be a policy issue and not necessarily a personnel issue. So as Latinos joined Black Grand Rapidians in this shared fight together, while they had some issues that brought them apart, this is one that brought them together. They demanded these police jobs, and they received a lot of pushback, a lot of resistance from everyday Grand Rapidians who were writing into the newspaper, saying that this was reverse racism, saying that these people did not deserve this, saying that if they don't want to be police, then don't give them fire access either, fire department access, right? These just really things that revealed the way they saw these groups. And the Fraternal Order of Police was one of the most staunch, right, resistors that had said, you know, if we do this, we'll have to make a plan for the Japanese, we'll have to make a hiring plan for the Japanese, for the Dutch, for the Polish, and named off all these groups, not realizing that, in fact, those were the people who had the jobs to begin with, right? Bar the Japanese, right? Wasn't a lot. So instead of continuing to attack the police department and the hiring, given the retrenched racism that existed in the rhetoric of policing, right, because policing came with power, they decided to go and to challenge the fire department, which in some places, in some cities, did have that political power. But in Grand Rapids, that was not necessarily the case. And so 2 Vietnam veterans, a Mexican-American man, Pablo Martinez, and James B. Ragsdale, right, an African-American man, went and joined in suit against the city of Grand Rapids. And in actuality, they were taking aim at the civil service exam that they charged did not actually predict job success, right, which was a very tried and true strategy of the 1970s in terms of getting access to state, local government jobs, right? This did not get as much, right? Did not get as much resistance from the public. And in fact, the city agreed to a consent decree basically saying, you know, we're not going to necessarily say we did anything wrong, but this is what we can do in the future, which included hiring programs, validating the test. Up until this point, they had been saying, the police department had been sending white officers to Grand Valley to learn Spanish and take Black history. They're like, if you can do that, you can help get these Black and Latino and Indigenous candidates through the test. You can spend that money on, giving them the proper training they need, as well as taking down some of the more prohibitive requirements to being a police officer that didn't actually fit the job. So there's Pablo Martinez and James Ragsdale. And Pablo will tell you as well, Pablo went on to have this wonderful 30-plus year career as a fire inspector, the first only Latino that I know of until this day. But it took Pablo at least 8 years before he became a firefighter, because he got word from the inside that these fellow firefighters would not protect him because of the kind of trouble that he had been causing, right, to show that. And I don't actually know what happened to James B. Ragsdale. And following up with records, I can't quite see that. And then lastly in the book, I talk about education. I talk about, so this headline, right, that shows that only half of Latin Americans were going to graduate that year, when actually in previous year, it had been up to 69% were not graduating, right? So only 1/3, 1 out of 3 Latinos in this time period were graduating high school. And so I look at this as a push-out rate, because many parents were asking for, parents and students alike, biliterate and bicultural education that put their communities in the positive light that they knew existed, and not kind of these textbooks that showed that they had deficits, right? But without, there was no Latino school teachers, maybe a couple, 2 or 3, up to 6 at one year, but they didn't necessarily stay. Paraprofessionals were one way that we were able to get Latina faces into classrooms, because all of this was signaling you don't belong. You don't belong in school. But one of the ways that I look at is that they solve this issue is through the creation of the Neighborhood Education Center. And this is Carmen Fite. She's actually a trained cosmetologist from New York City who moved to Grand Rapids with her husband, did not have any children at the time, and started to volunteer in the schools to meet other women, right, to meet other Latinas. And ended up becoming basically an education activist, and worked with the state level administrators, Black state level administrators, to apply for the Neighborhood Education Authority, a program that gave money to create schools that are community run, which is something very unique, which we can talk about also later. But they created this center that created the bicultural, biliterate, the programming that students needed to succeed. This is one of the murals that the students helped to create with Jose Narezo. This is on Granville Avenue. It doesn't look like it's in this good a shape anymore, but this was one of these other very public ways of claiming space and talking about their shared, Latino identity in the 1970s. It fits very much with the 1970s social movement aspect, where we have flags, we have the Black Power fist, the symbol for women, indigenous, a depiction of an indigenous person, gesturing to indigeneity again with the Aztec symbol of the sun, but also to working class peoples, right? To working class, to farm workers. And I end the book talking about gentrification on Granville Avenue and thinking about gentrification as a threat to the placemaking, the undoing of placemaking after 70 years of placemaking in that neighborhood and among others. And this is a mural by the Cultura Collective that they made in 2018, a youth-based arts program in very much in an affirmative way of claiming space, among other projects that they've done. But what I love about this particular picture is the acknowledgement in that the last 40 years, the amount of Latinos has grown and changed from where they were coming from, but also in gesturing towards Latino futurities, our belonging in this space in years and decades to come. We have Latinos in books, children, right, in books, and thinking about our future. So I'll end there. Thank you.